How's everyone? Woo! Yay! So I don't really know what time it is right now because I just got in from Washington, D.C. yesterday. And I stopped, I didn't even stop in Prague. I just got straight on a train, and I think I slept next to my train mates, possibly drooled on them. I hope it wasn't any of you because I'm slightly embarrassed. So I'm Jackie Kazil. I'm going to be talking to you today about user-centered open source. I sit on the board of directors of the Python Software Foundation. The Python Software Foundation supports conferences like this worldwide through grants and Django Girls. And then we directly put on PyCon as a whole. So how many people here, raise your hands, are familiar with user-centered design techniques? Okay, great. There's one other thing before I get started. I might do this really badly, but moje rodzina je česká, ale mluvím hrozný jako katastrofa. So user-centered design techniques are, it's a way of UX folks use to make their websites easier to use. And they use these techniques to get user feedback to say, where are users getting stuck? What kind of problems are they having navigating my website? So on and so forth. So the idea of this talk is to apply this to software, specifically open source, but you can also apply this to inner sourcing inside your company. So how many times have you looked at a library and you thought to yourself, wow, this is exactly what I need. This is the thing that I think is going to fix all the things so I don't have to rebuild it. And then you try to use it and you can't. And then you just feel frustrated. In this talk, we're gonna talk about how to fix some of those problems for your own libraries. Essentially, whether you are open sourcing, inner sourcing, or whether you even have closed source, your users are the software developers who are going to use your library after you or your piece of code after you. So this is also for those people who are going to be coming after you so they don't curse you. I'm going to give a loving shout out here now as far as closed source goes. I was working at the Washington Post after Adrian Holovati, who was one of the creators of Django. And I inherited his code. And this was when Django was, I think, 0.96. And there was some nice things happening. And I don't mean that nicely. So, I'm not an expert in this area of user-centered design. I learned most of these techniques from my colleagues at 18F, about half of it, and then half of it was stuff that I applied myself. 18F is a part of the US government. I was one of the founders under the Obama administration, and basically it's to improve technology for the public in the US by working with other agencies and building tech capacity in those agencies. Ultimately, when I was working there, I viewed the mission as having to serve the US citizens. And so if you don't go talk to people, you can't build them something that they need. Because what you want is not necessarily what you need. Okay, so this is a chair, in case you didn't know. And the reason why I bring this chair up is because I think it's a great example of user-centered design. Every object that exists in our lives evokes some sort of emotion within us. Now, we take chairs for chairs for granted because we use them every day. They do what they're supposed to do. this chair provides you relief. It doesn't cause any stress in your life. Some chairs are better than others. This is another chair. It's probably comfortable. It's a little weird. Is it usable? Yes. Does it serve the purpose of being a chair? Yes. Is it efficient? There's probably some extra materials in there that don't need to be in there. These are chairs. These chairs are not inviting at all. They kind of stress me out just thinking about trying to sit in them. And so it's this idea, like we talk about the chair, and it seems like a very simple idea, but there's lots of ways that it could go wrong. So the goal here is to build for humans. These chairs are like projects on PyPI or any other software ecosystem. Some are good, some are usable, and some others need to be destroyed. So the thing on the left could be called a chair, and the thing on the right could be called a chair. But which chair would you rather sit in had you had to sit in a chair? I think you'd want to sit on the right. And so some of this is taking what you have and saying, this is not friendly to users, taking it apart and rebuilding it to create the bare bones of what users can begin to start using. There's an artist, Marcel Duchamp, who would take everyday objects and call them art. He kind of inspired the chair introduction. And he has a quote, "Destruction is also creation." So feel like when you're listening to me today, think about, don't feel like you can't destroy things, let go of them. So the best example of this is URL-lib2 versus requests. So you don't have to know what the code says. You can look at the slides later. But just in case you aren't familiar, URL-lib2 is in the standard library, and requests was created to make 90% of what you're going to do with URL-lib2 easier. It's important to note that URL-lib2, while requests is easier to use, URL-lib2 requests would not exist with URL-lib2. It's not like requests would have been created without it. So before I continue, I'm going to harp a little bit back on giving back to the community and also the sprints. If you have a project that you want to work on, or you have a project that you are working on, think about how you can apply some of these things to that project to improve that project. So this is going to be split in sort of two sets of techniques. The first one is passive, sort of a best practices. If you don't do these things, then people might not be encouraged to participate. And then the second part is active, which is directly engaging people to get feedback. By the way, if you have feedback after the talk's done, I'd love to have it. So passive. The purpose of the passive approach is to create signal where noise is and creating an inviting environment. So I'm working on a Python library called Mesa, which does this modeling technique called agent-based modeling, ABM for short. And when I tried to figure out which ABM library was for me, what I found was 89 of them, written in whatever language you can imagine. The most popular being one, 2 in Java and 1 in Logo. And there wasn't any in Python. And then I did more research, and I found some in Python, but the environments that they were creating weren't necessarily hospitable for group collaboration. So then again, I was like, okay, what do I need to do to create the signal in all this noise? I love these next two examples. Twitter. When you go to Twitter, when you go look at the Twitter libraries for Python, there's a bunch. You go to GitHub, there's a bunch, and these have no descriptions. It's just a list. So you gotta literally click on each one of them to figure out what they do. So when you want to do something in Twitter by hitting the Twitter API, or you want to do something by hitting the GitHub API, you have no idea which is the best one. So we go through this process of, you click on it, you look at it, is there documentation, it hasn't been updated, that kind of thing, and you try to figure out, does this do what I want it to do? So one example that has a lot of best practices in it is the 18F FEC API. 18F, once again, is the company I used to, well, the government, US government agency I worked for, or sub-agency. And FEC is a Federal Election Commission. It is the finance data for who gives money to whom in federal elections. I'll just say, before I left, I voted absentee. So just in case my plane is late, I won't miss the US election. But it's a really interesting data set, and a lot of people had problems parsing it, so they created this API. And so the passive part is, the idea of having a landing page that introduces people to your project, and getting started, communication channels, documentation. And this is more for reference, but the entry points for these things need to be discoverable. So going back to the GitHub example, one of the things that both FEC and this particular example had was interesting as far as an artifact of what to look for when you're trying to figure out what library to use. And so they have all the basics, right? What I had mentioned earlier. But there's one of these libraries, to me, that is one I would want to use, and one that I would not, and the rest I would be less likely to use based off the commit data alone. And that is the GitHub 3.py, which that was an accidental find, but it was a really good example, so. And this again is the FEC GitHub history versus FEC 18F versus the GitHub 3 commit history. So, like I said, those are the basics: communicate, commit, test, and build regularly. Or consciously commit to retirement. If you're not going to do these basic things, let's put users aside for a second, like actually talking to them. And let's just say, if you're not going to commit regularly, if you're not going to document stuff, if you're not going to test, then you should consciously say, I am no longer working on this project, and inform people with such a line so they know that they shouldn't waste their time on your project. It's just one little line at top, like deprecated, retired, whatever word you want to use, so people can move on with their lives. This is the checklist manifesto. It's a pretty easy read. It's really great. It's a book about how checklists are used in various professions, so people don't die, like pilots use them, surgeons use them, so on and so forth. And it enforces certain things that you think are very, very obvious, but that people don't do, like washing hands before a surgery. Or one thing that cuts down on mistakes during surgery is actually having a team that may have never worked together introduce themselves to each other. And then there's an immediate repertoire with each other. So I created a checklist for what is the baseline for what you need to sort of lay out the table to say, come, work with us, use our library, so on and so forth. You need a landing page of some sort. That could be your GitHub page, but it needs to be GitHub or documentation page, but there needs to be something that is like a starting point, a getting started or tutorial. Install instructions, and install instructions would be based on your target user, whether it is somebody who's just getting started or whether it is somebody who is well experienced, that those install instructions should target them. Contribution guide, how do people give back? Responses in less than 24 hours, that actually came from a study on Mozilla ticket data and engagement rates that said there was a significantly more engagement when you respond to a request or ticket in less than 24 hours. Obviously, that doesn't happen all the time, but try. Clear Git workflow, labeled branches, license, so people know how to engage with your project comms and status, so people know when's the next update coming, what's in it, so on and so forth. Who owns the projects? As I said earlier, regular commits, tests, and builds. And other users is who is using the product or project to get people excited about using it also. For example, Google's using this or Mozilla's using this. Because then, as somebody who's sort of less invested, hopefully there may have been some due diligence by those larger users who did research on the stability and practicality of that project. And lastly, open by default. Once again, this is a concept that is based from 18F. Basically, when we were creating a policy for how to handle our software, we were open by default. And meaning, don't wait to open your work, open it right away, and get it out there, even if it's ugly, and then try to satisfy those things on the list as you're working. I know it's not as much fun sort of writing a README rather than coding the thing that you're building, but I know people get afraid of putting stuff out there, but I say throw it out there as soon as possible so people can start communicating with you about it and possibly collaborating with you. So the UDC, which is user-centered design process, is an iterative process where design evaluation steps are built in from the first stage of projects through implementation. This is basically saying that there is this iterative process of research, design, adaptation, and measure, which brings us to the engage part, where there is active engagement with users to make your project more distinct from other projects. This is the fun part. So I mentioned my project. This is its crude interface right now. Basically, you program these little entities to take individual actions, and it arises in some sort of complex matter or complex pattern. And so I'm going to use this as an example. You don't have to understand agent-based modeling to understand this. Just understand it's like a scientific modeling tool. So one of the things you can do is an inception or re-inception. This idea came out of Pivotal Labs, which is a consulting agency in the US. And the idea is that you identify the stakeholders, the users, the priorities, and the non-priorities. So non-priorities are also sometimes called, priorities are sometimes called goals, and non-priorities are sometimes called anti-goals. And so if you look at the users for a project like mine, you would have software engineers, you might have a college professor, a student, or a private industry researcher, or a data scientist. All of these people are going to have different needs for what they look for in a project. Some of those will overlap. But when you think about each of these, you want to think about who they are and what they need. For example, the college professor is most likely going to not have, is going to be more likely to be a subject matter expert rather than a coding expert. So how do you get them up and running with Python easily? And so then you might want to offer Anaconda setup. So focusing on the college professor, a lot of the experience that we found is that if they do have programming experience, sometimes it's Java, sometimes it's Python, which is awesome. But there's often, there's sometimes, let's say in this example, there's sometimes this attachment to old tools. not because there's a safety and security. So how do you encourage using Python? In my particular project, like I said, most of the projects before it that are successful are Java, and Logo. And so there's this like hesitation to get to move on to a new tool. It's also difficult to get tooling approved. So where do you find users? User groups, open call-out, conferences, direct emails, and sprints. Sprints have been one of the biggest blessings to the project that I've worked on in both users and contributors. I think for my project, I have had 26 contributors for this little, like, dinky, very specialized project because people just get interested in things. And I know I have at least 40 users for this very specialized project that 40 users that I know of. I don't know how many people, and it's still pre-1.0. So when you find users, a great way to get started with them is a general survey with the added question, so you can collect generalized data about the project, but with the added question of maybe we reach out to you so you can actually have an interview. So the interview is really interesting because there's actually interview techniques, like talk to your users, know what you want to capture from your users, so plan on ahead of time. Why are you talking to this particular person? Have your questions prepared. Designate a note taker. If you have two people, designate a note taker so one person can take notes, also participate, but it's hard for somebody to participate and think at the same time as someone's taking notes. Use electronic tools, don't use paper. Verbatim versus interpretation. So verbatim is copying something down exactly as someone said it. Interpretation is a summary of it. And this is important because they can evoke sort of two different types of actions that you might take forward. Annotate along the way, when you notice themes, and don't forget body language. And also consider privacy from the start. If somebody's talking about something intimate, you don't want to go and like an intimate situation about security or something, go and put that in like your GitHub repo. Or if they're talking about someone, you want to be conscious of the notes that you're taking and where you're putting it. Journey mapping. This is where you sit down with somebody and basically walk through the usage of your project. And so this is a sample journey map that was created with my project. And so the first one is, the top is happy, the bottom is sad, and it's really this rudimentary. So somebody says, oh, yay, I identified Mesa, this modeling library in Python. Oh, I tried to build a model. Well, that was difficult. Yay, I built a model. Oh, I tried to build a complicated model. Yay, I contributed back to Mesa to fix issues. And when you go through this process of sort of identifying like how somebody experiences your project, what you want to pay attention to are the bottom points. Because those are where your problems are, where you need to fix. When they're going happy, like, don't address those. And then you want to go back and do it again after you fix those problems. Another technique is affinity diagramming. So these are, so you have to imagine in real life, these would be, like little Post-it notes. It's a way, this affinity diagramming is a way to find themes in a collection of ideas. And when you start to, so first you have your group. It could be a group of users who are actually, and in my case, I have two different types of users. I have users who are trying to actually contribute back and users who are actually using the software. You might have, the users would write down what they're experiencing and the problems they're experiencing with the project. And then you start to group them together. So you have this idea that getting started is hard, models need to be tested in the top right, and then how to build on top of the project. And you think, okay, well, then you might think that, well, then you might think, okay, well, the getting started is hard, or bugs might be contributing to that, or maybe the docs are contributing to that. That's the thing we should focus on, because that's the thing that everyone's thinking of. But another technique on top of Affinity Diagram is dot voting. And so everyone gets a certain number of dots. It could be a pen that they just draw on the little note, and they say, everyone gets 3 dots to vote with. Vote on what you think is most important. If you want to boost something up further, you can place 2 dots on it because you think it's that important more than the other things. So in this case, there are 3 different different users here, and that way everyone gets an equal voice as well. So the black dot is the person who wrote the gray notes, and the yellow is the person who wrote the yellow notes, and the green is the person who wrote the green notes. And this is a really important technique because this allows the quieter voices in the room, somebody who might not be as dominant in the conversation, to be able to contribute back without trying to push into the conversation verbally. So they do a second vote, and then they do a third vote. And so yeah, that has some popularity, that sort of general area of getting started. But more importantly is models need to be tested. Even though one person wrote it, it was identified as the most important thing that needed to be done at that point in time. Another technique is rapid prototyping, the idea that you quickly create a rapid prototype. Now, often, there's an exercise that you can do where it's creating 3 prototypes in 3 hours. You basically create a prototype of 40 minutes, test the prototype with 15, and then take a break, and then repeat. And this is a great exercise to do when you first get started, to be able to figure out where to start. How do you know that the API endpoint that you're building is the right API endpoint to build? So usually this is done with a user interface. You draw something out, but you can do the same thing with code. And so this was the idea. So you can do this in 2 ways with code. One, write URL endpoints to see how people would actually get to a URL, but also if somebody is, in my case, subclassing some of the models that they might be building. How is it that they would subclass those, and how is it that they would use it? And then, of course, test and repeat. You have this first iteration, then you look at that first iteration and you say, okay, how can we make this better? What can we do to improve upon this? And this could be something that you do. You should be doing this all along the way. It's not just, you could be doing it now and you have something well established, or you could be doing it before you have any piece of code written to understand where you need to write, what you need to write for code. If you don't have users, you're doing it wrong. You're building it for yourself. So go find users. So a lot of these methods you can find at this link. 18F actually made a bunch of cards. It talks about the affinity diagramming, the dot voting, the journey mapping, and some other things that weren't shared. So the purpose of this, like I said, is to take something like that and bring it to that. And then this is a great, Kenneth, I'm probably going to say his last name wrong, Reitz. He was the one who created the request library that I showed, and he just happened to tweet this earlier this year, and it was a great tweet. So PS, your API is a user interface. Lastly, user feedback later on, sometime during this conference, somewhere, I'm not sure where, in a room somewhere. I'll be looking to share stuff about the Python Software Foundation and how you can get involved. I'm going to reiterate, it's really important to get involved. And I'm going to give a shout out to the local meetup organizers. A friend of mine and I in the US are working on a way to decrease local organizer meetup burnout, because it's really hard to get spaces and money and speakers every month over and over and over again and plan events. So in the meantime, what you can do is offer your local meetup organizers a hand and say, I will come and speak for you, or I will find your location or your money or something else. So that's one thing, less thing they have to do. But yeah, come find me and let's talk. Questions?
All right, if you have a question, please just raise your hand. There you go.
Hi, Benny. In 18F, do you only work on stuff that where the users are developers, or do you also develop stuff for end user, normal citizens which are not developers?
Yeah, so the work there was a combination. So like the FEC API was for normal developers, but we also did a project to find and request information from the government, and that was for, you know, like a website interface. There was a voter registration application, I think, that was recently created to get the public to register to vote. So it's a combination.
I'm asking because it's much more difficult to understand users when they're not developers, right? I mean, they're not as good in documenting their needs. And do you have any techniques for normal users or non-developer users?
Oh, so you say normal users like using like a website? Yes.
Yeah.
So we would actually, and this is something that I still do, is actually go out and find them. And so in the case of 18F, the users are across the United States. So people would actually go and visit different cities. There was a project on veterans, which are people who served in the military, and how to better provide them services. And they literally traveled, this one woman traveled all around the country to go talk to people. Now, that particular thing can be expensive. So the other way is try to find those communities online and then do it through virtual chats or phone. Another way recently is to try to target the community through talks. I gave a talk about the library that I was using, and when I saw people trying to use it, I learned very basic things. For example, I was using the same port as Jupyter Notebooks, and they were doing analysis through Jupyter Notebooks, and sometimes those ports would conflict with each other. And so sometimes you can, if you give a talk to a targeted audience regarding it, then you can then sit down with them afterwards and watch them use the site, and then talk to them and elicit some of those things from them. Great.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Jackie, for an amazing talk. And here's your applause. Thank you.